Every morning, the sun would creep through the blinds of that small-town IHOP in Springfield, Illinois. The smell of fresh pancakes and sizzling bacon floated through the air. Coffee pots hissed, plates clinked, conversations hummed around the room, and at a booth by the window, always the same booth, sat an elderly couple. They came in every Sunday morning, never missed a week. The man wore a worn cap, maybe ex-military, always polite. The woman, frail and soft-eyed, was nearly silent. Her hands, trembling and slow, could no longer feed herself. He'd pull her chair out gently, lay a napkin on her lap, and order her favorite, pancakes with strawberries and cream. Then he'd begin his quiet ritual, cutting her food into small bites, feeding her one forkful at a time, while his own breakfast went untouched. Most of us walked past without noticing. We were too busy, too distracted. But Joe Thomas, a waiter who had worked at that IHOP for over a decade, he noticed. He saw them every week. And every week, his heart pulled a little more. Joe, thinking, why does he always eat cold food? Why does no one help? If I'm not slammed, maybe I can do something. Joe Thomas wasn't the type to make a big fuss. He was the kind of person who knew everyone's order by heart, who greeted regulars like family, who stayed behind after his shift to help clean up without being asked. He grew up in a family where kindness wasn't optional, it was expected. Treat others how you want to be treated, his mother used to say, and he took it seriously. Even on his worst days, he smiled for customers. Even when tips were low, he gave his best. Over the years, Joe had seen that couple dozens of times. The husband never complained, never asked for help, just quietly cared for his wife. Sometimes, Joe wondered what their life was like outside the restaurant. Did they have children? Did they have help at home? Or was it just the two of them, relying on love and routine? On that Sunday morning, something in Joe shifted. Joe thinking, I've watched long enough. Today he eats his breakfast warm. He looked around the restaurant. A few teenagers laughing at a corner booth. A couple arguing softly near the door. A group of nurses on break scrolling through their phones. No one noticed the man who hadn't touched his eggs. No one saw the way he dabbed his wife's mouth with a napkin, then lifted another forkful to her lips. Joe tightened his apron, cleared his tray, and took one last glance at the kitchen. He wasn't behind. He had a window, a chance to do something right. He remembered his mother again, how she once handed her scarf to a homeless woman in the winter and never mentioned it again. How she packed an extra sandwich in his lunch every Friday in case someone else needed it. This was Joe's scarf moment. Small to the world, but big to the man who sat silently, giving everything he had to someone he loved. Joe took a breath and stepped forward. The restaurant was full, orders stacked high. Waitresses moved like clockwork between booths. Plates clattered in the kitchen. Coffee cups were being refilled every few minutes. It was the typical chaos of a late morning rush. But in the middle of all that noise, movement, and human energy, Joe saw them. They were right there in the same booth by the window, as always. But this time felt different. The husband, hunched slightly more than usual, looked especially tired. His eyes were red-rimmed, maybe from lack of sleep, maybe from something else. He cradled the spoon carefully, feeding his wife with a tenderness that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Her lips barely moved, but she smiled after each bite, like it was the highlight of her week. And her gaze never left him, eyes filled with a love that needed no words. Joe stood near the counter, frozen. His co-workers brushed past him, carrying plates, clearing tables. But for a second, he wasn't in the restaurant anymore. He was just a man witnessing something deeply human. A kind of devotion you don't see often. A kind of devotion that speaks louder than grand gestures ever could. He thought about all the times he had seen them, how they had sat there in quiet ritual, how this man had given up the comfort of a warm meal just to be sure his wife could eat with dignity. Joe glanced down at the pad in his hand. Table 5 was still waiting for their waffles, but his feet were already moving. He approached the booth slowly, like walking into a sacred space. The husband didn't notice him at first. He was too focused on wiping a bit of syrup from his wife's chin, his hand shaking just slightly. Joe knelt beside the table, voice low, respectful. "Let me give you a hand, sir. You enjoy your meal. I've got this." The man looked up, startled. There was a pause, a long one. His eyes searched Joe's face, looking for something. Sincerity, compassion, understanding. And he found it. He gave a small nod. No words, just trust. Joe slid into the booth beside the woman, carefully taking the spoon. He offered the next bite, slow and steady. The woman accepted it with a soft smile. Her eyes sparkled just a little more than before. The husband, for the first time in what must have been years, picked up his own fork and took a bite of eggs. He closed his eyes as he chewed, maybe tasting the food in a way he hadn't in a long time. The moment didn't stop the restaurant. Orders kept flying, people kept talking. But for Joe and for that couple, time slowed. Joe matched the husband's rhythm perfectly. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. Every small motion said enough. He noticed how the woman's shoulders relaxed slightly with each bite, how the man's breathing steadied, how the booth, once filled with the weight of silent sacrifice, now felt a little lighter. Behind them, a young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed toward the booth. The mother smiled gently and whispered, "That's kindness, sweetheart." One of Joe's co-workers paused nearby and looked over. She gave him a questioning glance. Joe nodded back with a tiny smile, as if to say, "Don't worry, I've got this." He kept feeding the woman until her plate was nearly empty. Then, he wiped her lips with a napkin and looked over at the husband. "She's got a good appetite today." The man chuckled, just a soft sound, but it was real. He looked at Joe, not just with gratitude, but with a kind of quiet awe, as if he hadn't expected the world to still contain this kind of care. Joe returned to his feet, gently smoothing his apron. "Joe, I'll check on you in a bit. Take your time." As he walked away, he didn't feel heroic. He didn't feel like he'd done anything special. He just felt right. Like this was what you did when you noticed someone who needed a moment of ease. And somewhere in the back of the restaurant, unnoticed by all, a phone camera clicked. A still frame of kindness, frozen in time, waiting to be shared with the world. She posted it on Facebook with a caption. Narrated post. "At IHOP today, I saw a server sit down and feed a disabled woman so her husband could eat. No fuss, no big scene, just kindness. My faith in humanity restored. It wasn't staged, it wasn't planned. Just a snapshot of someone doing good in a world where that often feels rare." By the next morning, the post had gone viral. Shares, comments poured in from around the world. Strangers moved to tears by a simple act of compassion. Joe's name was suddenly everywhere. TV anchors called it a moment that healed the internet. Bloggers called him the man who reminded us how to be human. People began showing up at the diner just to sit in his section. A local bakery delivered cupcakes for the whole staff with notes that read, "Be a Joe." 3 days after the post exploded, something unexpected happened. A Chicago-based nonprofit, Hope Bridge Community, hosted a surprise event called A Morning for Joe. They invited families who had been touched by Joe's story to gather in Springfield. Over 200 people showed up at a nearby community center, some in wheelchairs, others walking slowly on canes or crutches. Most of them had never met Joe, but each had a story of how someone once helped them eat, walk, or feel seen. They shared testimonials. A slideshow of Joe's moment played silently on a screen. Joe reminded us that dignity is in the details. Feeding someone with patience and grace. That's not service, that's love. Joe, who had been brought in under the impression he was catering the event, stood on stage, stunned. He wasn't wearing anything fancy, just his apron and name tag. He wiped his hands awkwardly on a towel before accepting the plaque. "Joe, I don't know what to say. I thought I was just doing my job, but thank you. Thank you for seeing her the way he sees her. That's all I was trying to do." Then, 2 days later, Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner walked through the doors of that little IHOP. Cameras followed. He shook Joe's hand and offered him a scholarship to study nursing. Let us thank him, not just with words, but with opportunity. It's nice to be noticed, but I didn't do it for the cameras. Just felt like the right thing to do. Behind the spotlight, Joe remained the same. He still cleaned booths, still remembered orders, still showed up on time every shift. So the next time you see someone struggling, remember Joe. He didn't change the world. He just changed a moment.